welcome everybody to the December edition of Kanban TO. And it's my pleasure today to introduce you to David Coe. He is the engineering lead for one of the engineering leads in the Index Exchange, where he has been leading the adoption of DevOps practices. So I met David several years back when their Kanban journey was starting. So I'm really excited and curious to hear how their story continued and where they landed after a while. So without further ado, I will pass it on to David. David, the floor is yours. We are eager to hear your story.
All right, thanks, Fernando. I'm gonna share my slides. Hope you guys can see that. All right. So I'll just do a very brief intro. I do actually have a slide dedicated for that, but I've been working at Index for a little over 12 years now, which could actually be considered a long time. I tried many different roles over that period, but now I am an engineering lead manager for the observability team at Index Exchange. I've taken the KMP training offered by Square North, Fernando and his team in the past, which apparently gives me the KMP title, which you can see next to my name here. So I had the pleasure to be able to put that there. Okay, so the agenda is actually pretty simple. I'll just be talking a little bit more about myself, maybe a bit about Index, which is the company that I work for. And then I'll clarify a little bit about what this session is versus what it isn't. And then my story sort of breaks down into, I guess, the era where I was transitioning from Scrum to Kanban, and on to how we kept iterating on Kanban, so I call it Kanbanization, and then some next steps that we're considering, and then we'll see if we have some time for a Q&A. So I've had like I said, a lengthy career at Index since 2012, and while there's certainly a lot of different stories to tell, I figured it might be the most effective way to speak about myself if I centered around the different technologies that I picked up along the way. So in my early days, that's when I learned some basics, things like Linux and its command line, VMware's vSphere for a lot of our VMs, and Jira and Confluence. I've actually had the pleasure of being the system admin of Jira and Confluence at Index for a few years, so that's why I'm explicitly mentioning here. So I was able to go into a little bit deeper into those two, maybe compared to an average show. And then in 2016 is when I became an ops engineer for the first time. I started picking up some of the industry standard DevOps tools such as Docker, Kubernetes, Ansible. This is also when I started to build my observability foundation, working with Zabbix, InfluxDB, and its tool stack, including things like Telegraph and Capacitor. I'm grateful for Index for supporting my growth all this time because today there you go. I work with a whole plethora of industry standard tools related to observability, such as Grafana for serialization, Prometheus and Mimir for time series metric data storage, and the Elastic Stack for handling a lot of our logging use cases, Terraform for managing configs for some of the tools that are listed. And then as for the company that I work for, Index Exchange is a global ad tech company, essentially a supply-side platform where media owners can maximize their value for their content on basically any screen where ad media can reach. We are a proud industry pioneer with 20 plus years of expertise and experience accelerating the evolution of the ad tech industry. And the part that I particularly like is that we're an engineering-focused company. And I'm happy about that as an engineer, of course. And while we have our roots from Toronto, Canada, today we have offices in different countries around the globe, and the teams are all dedicated to driving industry standards and building technology that delivers scale, efficiency, and long-term value for our customers and partners. Speaking of scale, just to give you an idea what our ops team is responsible for, so that you can kind of picture what our ops team is having to deal with over the course of my story here. Today, there's hundreds and billions of events processed, streamed, and stored on a daily basis, and easily petabytes of data managed in our big data clusters. And to maximize our reach and to minimize latency, we have several data centers on different continents around the world, hosting thousands of servers, facilitating the transactions. I think that's what makes my job so challenging, but so exciting at the same time as the lead/manager of the team of the observability champions. So that's a little bit about me and the company I work for. Before diving in, I just want to quickly go over what the session is and what it isn't. So this session isn't a Kanban 101. I'm not that knowledgeable. At least that's not my intention here anyway. And I'm certainly not here to just preach about why or how you should Kanbanize, but rather it's just me talking about my side of the story, where I took my team from Scrum to Kanban. And it's me sharing one real life scenario where Kanbanization was successful in an engineering ops team. And I'm also hoping this to be a knowledge exchange going both ways. So please, if you have any questions, suggestions, feedback, I encourage you to pick up my brain when I'm perhaps done with my core content. But it'd be a small win for me if some of you guys were able to pick up something useful from my story. Okay, so I wanted to start with this quote, which, despite popular belief, is supposedly not something Charles Darwin actually said, which I find a little bit funny. It is a paraphrase of what he wrote, apparently. Anyway, the actual quote goes, according to Darwin's Origin of Species, it is not the most intellectual of the species that survives. It is not the strongest that survives, but the species that survives is the one that is able best to adapt and adjust to the changing environment in which it finds itself. Apparently, some guy named Leon C. Megginson, who was a professor of management and marketing at Louisiana State University, wrote this in 1963, which is actually a paraphrase of Darwin, which was later presented to the world as if it were an actual quote from Darwin's famous book. Um, I found a page that talks about this on the University of Cambridge website. So that's where the credit goes, but this is really all way besides the point, because the point is that this quote is relevant to some things that I'll be highlighting throughout the session. A Kanban implementation wouldn't have been successful if my team and I weren't able to adapt and adjust to both changes around us and changes within us. All right, so with that out of the way, let's start with my story of how we went from Scrum to Kanban. During the earlier years, as I mentioned earlier, I wore several different hats. Just to mention a few, I was managing VMs using VMware vSphere, IT support, workstation support, talents grading. I mentioned I did system admin for Jira and Confluence. I mean, we were a much smaller org back in 2010s, and I was desperate to get involved on as many opportunities as possible. Now, was I young and ambitious? Maybe half right, I was young and very green, but probably because I knew how green I was, I simply tried to stay valuable and relevant. And so when I became the system admin for Jira and Confluence, sometime in the mid-2010s, I wasn't just responsible for the infrastructure and the operations side of the on-prem Jira and Confluence instances, but I was also responsible for providing various Jira components for our users, as in the PMs and developers at the time, such as workflows, custom field configurations, issue types, and board configurations. And this is when I was naturally able to learn about Scrum and the concept of sprints, particularly when I was interacting with a program team, the project coordinators at the time, hearing about their project tracking requirements. In 2016-ish, I officially transitioned into the ops engineer role, and this is where I built a foundation for what would eventually be the focus for my team, which is observability. I wanted to address the general lack of monitoring of our production system and decided to start with a popular monolithic system called Zabbix. It looked easy enough to get set up, and it did in fact make it very easy to monitor things like CPU and memory and disk usage on our production bare metals. So once I had that going, it wasn't too long after until I had the opportunity to be part of a small team with two other existing ops engineers. And then I got very excited, not just because the team's focus was going to be monitoring, and that's what I was already familiar with, but more so because I can finally implement Scrum for my own team. Now that I'm part of a team with a general focused area, I didn't want to just log tickets. I believed in having a structured process for the team to maximize team efficiency and collaboration. So now that I think back on this, I might have just been swept up in the agile hype, maybe a little bit too eager to see how Scrum could transform our way of working. So anyway, I dove headfirst into implementing Scrum. We introduced all the standard ceremonies like daily Scrum, daily Scrum, sprint planning, retrospectives, and even sprint demos whenever applicable. To track our work, we built a dedicated Scrum board in Jira, complete with tailored workflows, statuses, and fields. We implemented story pointing as the practice to estimate our tasks and try to create meaningful sprint commitments. It all seemed very promising at first, at least to me. However, as we progressed, some issues began to surface. During the first years of Scrum, the simplest aspects posed a challenge. I could tell I wasn't doing a great job in motivating the team to engage meaningfully in the new process, and it was often a struggle just to get everyone to attend Scrum ceremonies. Now, I don't blame them, because going from having virtually no process to the Scrum framework can be a big jump, and there's no shortage of work. People are extremely busy as is, where essentially seemingly every task is high priority, and I probably wasn't necessarily educated enough on Scrum to be able to convince the team that that's exactly why we need some project management framework implemented. Eventually, as the team grew and matured with Scrum, we were at least able to have consistent team engagement and attendance in the ceremonies. Even then, we continued to experience other issues. One of the biggest challenges was constant spillovers. For several quarters, over 90% of our sprints resulted in over 30% of the committed work left unfinished, which was then carried into the next sprint. It became a pattern we couldn't really break out of because of the nature of our ops role. That constantly required us to address ad hoc tasks, such as deployment requests from dev teams, production investigations that spawned from what we noticed in our monitoring tools. I mean, these are times before, we had mature automated deployment pipelines, so ops engagement was frequently called upon. Our daily scrums often constantly ran over time because we couldn't effectively time box discussions. Action items from retros kept getting pushed off and deprioritized. Not everyone even fully understood the purpose of retros or how to engage effectively. I've heard from some members that retros often felt like a formality rather than a meaningful opportunity for improvement, which is kind of hurtful. And one more thing, we weren't leveraging metrics like velocity and lead time to guide us any better. So people start to feel the rigid structure of sprints don't align well with the ad hoc nature of our operations roles. We were losing confidence and belief in our own Scrum implementation. On top of that, we weren't able to bridge the existing silos within the team, nor did we foster enough collaboration to improve knowledge sharing. We're basically experiencing a process fatigue. Now, eventually, everyone, including myself, started to feel that maybe the way we implemented Scrum wasn't quite the right fit for us. Now, having said all of that, I am by no means here to simply badmouth Scrum. There's nothing wrong with Scrum. There's obviously been tons of Scrum success stories. In fact, if we take a look at the challenges that are listed, we'll go back in a bit. There you go. You'll notice that nothing on the list is a direct consequence of something in Scrum, but rather there's just consequences of how our team implemented Scrum or how our team didn't do certain things sufficiently, like how we never figured out how to identify key team metrics in order to make data-driven decisions on things like capacity and estimations. At the time, though, that wasn't really the point. All we knew was that whatever we had simply wasn't working out, and we needed something different, something with more flexibility. The majority of us wanted less rules, less ceremonies, less being forced to do something we didn't really believe in. Then I discovered Kanban. Now, I've heard of it already by then because I knew that Jira lets you create two different types of agile boards, Scrum and Kanban. Not able to exactly remember what motivated me to start researching into Kanban, but I suspect it's related to all the Scrum issues that we've been experiencing. Initially, I was drawn to it for what was probably the wrong reason, but hopefully a common reason, the expedite lane. This feature seemed like a convenient way to handle the constant stream of ad hoc tasks that defined a large part of our operations roles. And over time, as I learned more about Kanban, I started to realize there's obviously more to Kanban than that. But I think at that time, I was just trying to try something different. So I ended up making a proposal where I presented the idea of overhauling our team process by replacing Scrum with Kanban. And I highlighted the following as my selling points. No more sprints. That meant no more biweekly sprint planning sessions. And the expedite lane, of course. As I mentioned earlier, the team desired more flexibility, less rules, and maybe that's why folks are so easily sold on the idea of Kanban, at least with the content of my very minimal proposal, right? Our leaders got sold on it so much, though, that they approved an on-site Kanban training session for us, including them. And in fact, over the course of a few years, they gave us 3 different on-site Kanban training sessions, and I consider myself very lucky because each training session equipped me with different knowledge and experience. The first session taught me the origin of Kanban, where it all started, what a Kanban board could look like, what work in progress limits are, how to and when to utilize the expedite lane. The trainers from that time got the whole ops division to participate in a simulated Kanban board scenario, much like a board game. It really helped me visualize in my head how I might be able to construct a board in Jira for at least my team to leverage so that we can build a new team-specific project management process that actually works. And that's exactly what I was going to do until I remembered that people are tired of rules and they want to perhaps break free of my shackles of Scrum rules. So I ended up with the following proposal. We are going to do a swap over to Kanban. We're not going to do sprints, no more biweekly sprint planning, not even backlog grooming or story pointing, just dailies and retros, and no whip limits yet. So you might be asking, how do you know what to work on if you don't at least groom your backlog? Yeah, we didn't actually have to worry about something like that at all during those days. I mean, there was never any shortage of Jira issues to pick up somehow. I guess as our teams grew, the amount of possibilities owned by each ops team expanded significantly as well. Each new member that we hired was a highly trained, experienced professional, and we each had a fairly clear picture of what needed to be done to meet our project goals, or so we thought. We had the freedom of logging the relevant Jira issues to track our tasks. Now, of course, the lack of planning and grooming introduced some disparity between members in terms of the scope of each work, what the work is, what is the urgency, why is this work happening. But compared to the process fatigue we've been experiencing prior to the new Kanban implementation, these are minor issues that we were more than willing to address on the fly. It also made my job as the team process advocate more enjoyable because it was quite visible to me that once this got implemented, my team members are much happier with the new world with less rules. I mean, little did they know this was just the beginning of my long journey of small incremental changes. Now, speaking of which, you'll notice I didn't remove retros. This was important for me to keep because I believe that if I took this away, we would be at a huge risk of having little to no process iteration opportunities. And luckily for me, it didn't take too much convincing of others. I think all I said was, well, this is a big change, guys, going from Scrum to Kanban. So I want to keep the retro cadence to continuously evaluate and monitor how it's going together with the team. And I don't think hardly anyone opposed that intent. Maybe they were just too happy to be part of to part their ways with sprints and stuff. But anyway, from there on for a few months, we got used to working with the new process. I intentionally didn't introduce any new elements or propose any major changes too quickly because I wanted to provide fair opportunities to my teammates to observe process gaps and initiate talking about how to bridge those gaps during retros. I wanted whatever we end up iterating on or implementing to be very intentional with team-wide alignments. And just to highlight some of the questions that the team asked, not me, the other guys asked internally during those time. Tasks that seem simple at first actually end up taking much longer. We need to plan better. Or how about our leads often, more often than not, actually, would like to hear from us how long a project is going to take to deliver. How can we better answer instead of just responding based on our gut feelings? Or how about everyone seems to have a different understanding of how to leverage the expedite lane? Is that the case, actually? And why is that the case? I mean, these were excellent questions, but well within my expectations, given all the rules that I just stripped, right? But for me at the time, it was crucial that my teammates identify and surface potential process gaps on their own, because now it's become a very natural step of problem solving as a team, starting with, well, we have a problem, followed up by, we might have a solution. And I did have solutions, or I had a feeling I knew what the solutions were anyway. So I slowly started to open my arsenal back up, starting with, well, let's start doing backlog grooming, along with the following proposal on what we would do in each grooming. We're going to do it every 3 weeks, so it's not too much of fatigue. We spend time stack ranking in each session, and also we talk about what we want to put into the ready queue for roughly the next 3 weeks and ask ourselves some meaningful questions to do that, like, what is the issue? What is this task? Who is our stakeholder here? What is the urgency or timeline requirement? Why is this issue? So we implemented this and it worked out pretty well. In fact, before we were scheduled for the next on-site Kanban training, we were doing backlog grooming every 2 weeks instead of every 3, because at some point we all started to see that there's a clear value of doing backlog grooming. And in addition to this process, when we were now resolving constant stream of project work while still accommodating for ad hoc requests, thanks to our expert lane, there wasn't any good way to measure or quantify any of that success at the time, but I knew that would come to us in due time. So more into Kanbanization. The second division-wide Kanban training session taught me that happened, and it taught me 2 very important concepts: class of service and the concept of walking the board from right to left. And I think it was around this time when I realized that our manager started to get all the ops engineer hires to join our team first, regardless of their ultimate intended destination in terms of team and or focus area, such that they can get used to a well-established internal project management process. I would say this probably fueled my team with a lot of confidence in our own process. We were doing regular dailies, groomings, retros, and I no longer had to worry about engagement and attendance. And so we were able to write a momentum to begin introducing the newly learned concepts. Walking the board from right to left was a simple cultural shift to implement, and it just took us some time to get used to thinking like that. I would say that from this point on is when we truly started to Kanbanize, because walking the board from right to left started to force us to prioritize resolving tasks over starting new tasks. And class of service took us some time to get used to as well, but the team generally welcomed this new dimension of issues. I mean, this new dimension acted as a minor forcing function during groomings to get us to do deeper dives into the nature of the task, because we needed to ask ourselves some questions like, is there a strict time after which this becomes urgent? Or how long can this tech debt item going to remain as not a priority? In case you need a refresher, I pulled these graphs demonstrating the different cost of delay we need to consider when determining the class of service of a task. So for example, we say the class of service for a task is likely of the expedite type if the cost of delay is quite immediate and high. In another task, the cost of delay may simply constantly rise as the time goes by, and that could be considered to be of the standard class. Now, this visual implies there's a real dollar value to the cost of delay over time. Well, I mean, that is how a lot of teams and organizations may do things. But in my opinion, it doesn't always have to be of real dollar value. It could be representing other quantitative measures, qualitative measures, I should say, such as increasing amount of risk if you don't do a security patch, or filling in a gap that you found in your test coverage. For us, the one problem was that at the time, we didn't exactly know what to do with this new dimension after we labeled the class of service and all of our in-flight plus backlog tier issues. with it, but I mean, I wasn't too concerned with that. I was confident that in due time we'll be able to start looking at team metrics and leverage them during retros to discuss different ways to keep track of team performance. I mean, I had this confidence because the slow incremental change to the team's project management process was working. In fact, we can summarize this together now. Um, we started out with the more, I guess, the bare bone structure with just dailies and retros. Then we added tri-weekly grooming, and then it became bi-weekly. And then we added class of service as a new dimension to all of our Jira issues. And we also implemented the culture of walking the board from right to left. And perhaps the most important amount, we no longer have to worry about team engagement or attendance to ceremonies. I'm going to list a few more that we additionally introduced soon after that second training. WIP limits, swarming, and strict rule on what can be expedited. After adopting the idea of walking the board from right to left, it pretty soon became very clear that we need a way to better manage the flow of tasks coming from the left side of the board. We had already learned about work in progress limits from both of the training sessions, so neither the concept nor the purpose of it, rather, was foreign to the team. So when I made the suggestion to start putting down some WIP limits to our columns, the question wasn't why do we need to do that, but more of what numbers do we need to start with. I think the topic of how to determine your WIP limits probably deserves another whole separate mini session, but I'll try to cover very quickly how we initially went about it. We looked at team capacity. We simply considered the number of team members in the team. And then parallelization. We thought about how many issues per column can actually be worked on in parallel. Current WIP. What I mean by that is we took a look at how many Jira issues there are currently in each of our board columns. Now, if I recall correctly, I think we initially started with the current WIP numbers for each column and aimed to slowly work our way down as necessary. So for example, if we had like 8 items in the in progress column and we probably set the initial WIP limit to that, which is arguably a little too high, knowing that this would, but we knew that this would need to decrease. I mean, we eventually realized a simple flaw in our board, which was that if there's 5 members in the team, it might not make sense to have 8 things in progress and 5 things in review column and 3 things in the deployment column. Because you really have to be looking at the total in-flight tasks. So that's when we started to be a bit more mindful of the number of team members and the realistic feasible parallelization given any task, which helped bring down the WIP limits to more reasonable counts over time. I'll go more over this if someone is interested in the topic as time allows later. But just wanted to cover that real quick on how we went about WIP limits. And then the next concept is swarming. So swarming in our context is an approach used by agile teams to collaborate together on a single item usually. Some teams apply this approach for certain high priority tasks. But for us, we decided to trigger this approach whenever an item on the board had been sitting in the same column for more than X number of days. I say X because that really depends on what works for you, what doesn't. Even for us, that number changed a few times over the years, but the general rule still stands today. I would say swarming provided largely 2 benefits. It helped the team with stop starting and start finishing concept, which is a phrase we learned along with the idea of walking the board from right to left. It naturally encouraged the team to collaborate, strengthening the bonds between members, providing knowledge share opportunities as swarming naturally happens, and all that good jazz. And another thing I mentioned in the list is a new process. Sorry, 1 second. My notes are not loading. Okay, so a strict rule for expedite lane. This was important for me because on a number of different occasions when tasks were put into the expedite lane by a member of the team, not everyone necessarily agreed on that decision. This was, I would say, a hindrance to maintaining a consistent, predictable flow of work. And I didn't want anyone to be surprised when they wake up in the morning to see a task they don't recognize in the expedite lane. So we made one simple rule. In order to expedite any task, every team member available that business day needs to agree on the decision and the motivation to expedite it. That way, there's no surprises, and we aren't necessarily blocking ourselves on those that are away on PTOs or something. I mean, thinking about it now, I'm very glad that my team and I were able to mature the process this far by this point. Because what happened not too long after all of that was COVID-19 and the lockdown. And so just like everyone here, we suddenly had to get used to working remotely every day without meeting a single team member in person. But that didn't stop us from positively iterating on our team process and project management method. So just to list a few optimizations we introduced during the lockdown, and just to demonstrate that, that didn't stop us necessarily. We actually transitioned to doing grooming every week. As at some point we voted this as an action item for my retro because some people preferred having frequent shorter groomings. So we ended up transitioning, I think it was from an 1.5 hour long biweekly groomings to an hour long weekly groomings. Actually, today, we now only do a 30-minute long weekly groomings, but that frequency of doing it once every week is still of today. And then story pointing, we felt that because we felt the need to do more structured, consistent planning at the story level. But we couldn't do this in person, obviously. So we found a website. It's just scrumpokeronline.org. It's very easy to use. You don't have to sign up or anything like that. You certainly don't have to pay anything. So if you're looking for something super lightweight, I recommend trying that out. And then we were also doing online retros. We try using different tools, including Miro. Now we almost always just use this website called retro.app. But I mean, the tool is just a preference thing. I can recommend the tool, and I do. But you should really try different ones yourself to see what suits you and your team better. I know some teams prefer using Miro and or Mural, so it's really completely up to your team style. And then metric reviews. Yes, we finally started to review some metrics in Jira. Actionable Agile was available as a plugin to Jira at the time. So I leveraged it to monitor a few things like cycle time, how long an issue was marked as blocked for, total issues resolved in a week, month, quarter. And then we started this thing called Team Vibes Sessions. This was less of a formal ceremony, but something we wanted to implement to further encourage team collaboration during the lockdown. It was basically just a 2 to 3 hour session blocked off each Thursday afternoon where members were encouraged to bring something they want to share, discuss, teach, learn, something to swarm together on because they might think that might be a more efficient use of the team's time, really anything. And it wasn't something we were forcing ourselves to commit to and participate either. So some weeks we would just cancel the session for various reasons like lack of member availability or whatnot. But all in all, I think this Vive session was a great idea to get teams to stay engaged and keep feeling like they're working as part of the team, even when they're not able to physically meet their team members. Okay, so here's where I get to talk about Fernando. I mean, another very notable milestone from the lockdown that I have to mention is that we received the third Kanban training session, this time virtual, and this time from Varscola North. And yes, this is where I had the pleasure to meet Fernando virtually, of course. And I think this was the one designed for managers. And this was, I would say, incredibly valuable to us, particularly because of these several benefits. Fernando and his team helped me validate some of the good practices our team had already implemented, such as WIP limits and swarming. Training was participated by all the leads in TechOps, which significantly saved my work because I had been meaning to teach Kanban myself to the other other TechOps teams. We learned the importance of managing flow of work, which has several benefits, including things like more predictable planning. And finally, we learned how to apply work item types to every task, adding yet another dimension to our Jira issues, which is actually something that's meant to help us better manage the flow of the tasks also. I mean, honestly, I think it's thanks to this training session from Fernando and his group that helped me apply the very necessary, I would say, finishing touch on our Kanban process. Now, having said that, I'm actually going to fast forward us by a little bit because I figured that around this point in my journey, we would be getting to some very like team specific, case specific iterations and optimizations, and not everything I dive into may be of value to you guys. I figured I will talk a little bit about metrics to be able to make a final point in the end, but hopefully our audience here were able to see one very important point that I've already made, which is that building any framework for your team, division, or Kanban or Scrum is meant to be a journey, right? Mine was a long one over the course of several years in the same org, same team, luckily for me, whilst making small incremental changes. But it would be a small win for me if some of you guys were to be able to internalize some things from my story, such that your journey isn't necessarily several years, but more like several months or even weeks to accomplish what I have accomplished. Okay, so I just want to make that remark before shifting our gears a little bit, transitioning to a more specific topic, which is how my team has been doing project estimations and how it's helping us maximize quarterly commitment deliverables. I wanted to highlight this topic explicitly because the outcome of this is a good representation of the overall success of our Kanbanization. So Index now practices what's known as PI planning for engineering, where PI stands for program increment. A program increment for us is essentially a quarter, typically shifted forward by I think it's like 2-ish months. Each PI has a set up number of sprints, usually 6 2-week sprints, and every engineering team follows this calendar. That way, everyone's delivery cycle is synced, and of course, the PI planning cycle is also synced, allowing all eng teams to participate together every few months on what their next PI should look like. TechOps, of course, participates in PI planning as well. I knew that my team would need to be able to respond to some key relevant questions with confidence, such as how much work can your team deliver in the next upcoming PI? And what better way than to have data represent my answer, right? And so what I'm about to go into is my team's current method of estimating our team capacity for the immediate next upcoming PI, measured in the number of JIRA issues. So first, I take a look at how many issues the team managed to close in each of the last 3 PIs. Let's assume that PI 6, we resolved 65. In PI 7, we resolved 80. In PI 8, we resolved 57 issues. And now we're trying to plan for PI 9. I will take an average of the issues resolved in each PI. So in this example, it comes out to be about 67.3. Okay. And next, I write down all the PTOs and stat holidays. So for example, Bob has 7 days off in mid-December. Joe just has 1 day off in December, which is kind of weird. And David has 5 days off. I don't actually have Bob and Joe on my team. That'd be great. But but as for stat holidays, I take the number of stat holidays and add it to each member. And so our total out of office days in this scenario turns out to be 22 days. Okay. Now let's put all this together. Average capacity from last 3 PIs is around 67.3 issues. Total out of office days is 22 days. The plannable duration of this current PI started on November 25th, if I recall correctly, and ends on January 31st. So that's 68 days, including weekends. There's 3 members in the team. And I calculated what I refer to as the out of office factor, which is calculated as a ratio between total days off and total days observed by all 3 members. And so the actual formula looks like this, where the out of office factor is total days off divided by multiplication of total days and of total members. So in our example, that factor comes around to be 0.108. And then I take this factor and apply it on the initial estimate of 67.3 issues just by multiplying it by the factor. And then I subtract that from 67.3. So our result here in this example is around 60 issues. I'm almost done. There's a final factor that slashes this estimate even more significantly, which is something we refer to as the uncertainty factor. The uncertainty factor here is meant to represent the amount of uncertainties throughout the PI, measured in the number of unexpected, unplanned issues that may come up during the PI, after the PI planning. Because let's face it, it's very difficult to do quarterly planning perfectly. I mean, we could barely do perfect sprint planning for 2 week periods. So it only makes sense to do to consider some amount of uncertainty when planning a whole quarter, right? Now, there's a consideration of potential lack of, sufficient planning, but there's also requests that just cannot be predicted. Um, this is essentially important, I would say, to consider for ops teams like our team in TechOps. A significant chunk of our role is working together with other teams on things like deployments, production defects, incidents, and providing guidance on how to use our DevOps tools and pipelines. And not all of that can be predicted. So considering all of that for now, we are saying this uncertainty factor is 50%, meaning if our team capacity is estimated to be 60 issues for the upcoming PI, we are saying we expect to observe 30 unexpected, unplanned issues, which is 50% of 60 throughout the PI. And we would actually have to work on those items in that PI. And with that, our final team capacity estimation for PI 9 came out to be 30 issues. So again, I just want to share this, one, because we've seen good results from this estimation method, and I thought maybe someone else might be interested. And two, I wanted to lead us into this next slide. Remember when I said way back when we were trying a Scrum for several quarters, over 90% of our sprints resulted in over 30% of the committed work left unfinished? Well, with what we built and the estimation tactic I just went over, we managed to have 3 consecutive PIs with 100% completion with 0 spillovers, which I would say is a pretty significant win for the team. And I'm really glad we started leveraging metrics because I'm able to speak about our success in this manner. Okay, so now that I've made that point, I think I can wrap us up with some future considerations for our next steps. Okay, starting with incorporating story points into PI capacity estimations. I think it's important to add story points as a new priority dimension instead of just measuring capacity by a number of issues. I mean, so far we've been doing the estimations assuming that over the course of a few months, the average size and complexity of stories is roughly even. But this can be dangerous because you could have a PI with 30 issues with all 0.5s, and then you can have a PI with 30 issues with all 0.8, technically speaking, theoretically. We actually already laid out the foundation for this by making a team agreement to document the total number of story points we start with at the beginning of the PI immediately after PI planning, and comparing it to the total number of story points from all the JIRA issues that we would have closed by the end of that PI. I mean, I think we still need to have more conversations with the team about what exactly to do with that. But I have some ideas I've been meaning to run by the team. Again, if you guys are interested in this topic, we can discuss after. And then I put down here leveraging more of Jellyfish. Jellyfish, if you haven't heard of it already, is a software engineering intelligence tool that can integrate with tools like Jira, GitHub, GitLab to surface some key metrics by analyzing various forms of signals from the tools that I just mentioned. I think Jellyfish probably deserves its own 2-hour session on just what it can do for you if you use those tools like Jira and Git. So I'm not going to do that at all. But just to give you an idea, out of the box, it easily exposes things like cycle time of issues from date A to date B in a specific epic. Number of issues closed from date A to B, which can be broken down by dimensions like epic, issue type, etc. Story points contributed by teams and team members. PRs, MRs opened, resolved, or participated by teams, which can also be broken down by members. And then various members of how well your team is doing based on all of the above mentioned metrics compared to the division, compared to the whole org. I mean, there's essentially a whole world there that I still want to explore more to see what we can leverage there for not just capacity estimations, but also for something that may help me do my job better as the team's lead and manager. And luckily for us anyway, we onboarded Jellyfish earlier this year to integrate with our Jira and Git. So it's just a treasure island waiting for me to explore more. So those are more of our immediate next steps, but I'm pretty sure my team and I will end up coming up with several more in our future retros. So it is very much an ongoing story for us. And so that is basically all I got for you guys today. If you felt like I was speeding through some parts of the story, that is completely normal because that is exactly what I did. I actually struggled a bit to condense my multi-year long journey and index into what was it, like a maybe 15-minute talk. Um, so what I would encourage you guys to do, if you're interested in hearing more about a certain topic or certain decision that I made, or certain decisions that I didn't make along the way, I can try to answer some questions now. Or you're more than welcome to message me on LinkedIn after the session so we can have more focused private chat. Thank you, Fernando, for giving me this wonderful opportunity. And thank you for those of you who made the time to join me today. And of course, last but not least, huge thanks to Index Exchange for giving me the support that I very much needed for this. So thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, David, for your story. It's very interesting to hear. So in your last example, when you were talking about the way you were planning capacity, you talked about this uncertainty factor that you're using to adjust the available capacity. So in essence, what you're doing there is to reserve some capacity for work that will show up, right? So yeah, exactly that. So you say,
Yep.
well, we have capacity for 60, but we think that 30 may show up and announce, so we just commit to 30, leaving room for the rest, right? That's how that works.
Yep. Yep.
So I was wondering if you've been capturing, because you've been doing this for a few PIs already, right?
Yep. Yep.
So have you been capturing some information about those items that actually showed up to give you an idea what the composition of this unknown work is?
Yes. So we started doing exactly that actually in the last PI. Um, because we actually realized that we've been so a hidden message here is we've actually been abusing this uncertainty factor to cover the fact that we've maybe rushed some of our PI planning. There could have been a lot more stories that we generated from the get-go. And so actually when we were doing PI9 planning, we actually took that feedback for ourselves to do spend a lot more time and energy and effort into generating, just being more granular on the way we plan our epics. And so we did end up creating a lot more stories relative to, I think, our past quarters. Um, but yeah, so one thing that we started doing is whenever we ended up having to generate an ad hoc request on our own, we would do like a micro retro. Like, we'll ask ourselves, how do we miss this, right? Or is this something that just was inevitable, right? And so we're actually trying to internalize different ways of tracking those differently. I think someone actually made a suggestion of um, labeling these things separately. So anything that we decide as, okay, this was inevitable, like this had to be ad hoc. No one could see this. We'd label that separately, and then for things that we could have seen, we'd label those separately, and then we'll probably end up monitoring, I guess, the changing volumes or perhaps measured in percentage or something like that over the course of the next PIs as a success metric to see how well we are doing our plannings.
Right.
And so, yeah, that's you made a good point. That is exactly something that we're trying to drill into now.
Mhm. And have you considered or have you done any classification on that work in terms of failure demand or value demand? Because if it's failure, if it's mostly failure demand, this is work that essentially can be eliminated eventually by introducing some improvement, and that's capacity you reclaim, right? Either for
Yeah, yeah. So I think that's what we're trying to sort of identify and categorize with the new labeling proposal. Yeah.
Mhm.
So I think it's we haven't collected the whole data yet because we just started collecting the data for this PI. So I guess I'm excited to see what we end up seeing at the end of this one.
Yeah. The other thing that I noticed it was fascinating in your story is how you started with Scrum, noticing some shortcomings, and you got rid of practices, and then you started introducing some ideas based on Kanban, and some of the other practices that were abandoned came back, right? So like story pointing, for example, there was story pointing, and you got rid of it, and somehow it's coming back. So what's informing that?
So from my perspective, that was kind of always my plan. So it was all within the expectation. I knew that, and I kind of implied this in the middle of the story too. When I took away a bunch of things like backlog grooming and story pointing and all
Right,
that stuff,
grooming is another example of that, yes.
yeah, yeah, I knew that at some point someone that remotely cares about organization or project management would raise some concerns like, hey, like I think we need to plan this better. I think we need to be able to answer questions like, how long is this thing going to take? Well, that's when I start to, gently be like, well, it's good that you asked that because then we could do this thing called backlog grooming. Or, if we did story pointing, we'd have a better idea of what, roughly our tasks are going to be. And, if they amount to a certain size for the epic, maybe that's something that we can, reference to answer questions like how long is this going to take? Right. So
Mhm.
that's kind of how I went about re-adding some of the very necessary
Right.
components along
Mhm. I'm probably informed by other things rather than
the way.
doing them because the Scrum guide says so. You're reintroducing them to solve a
Yeah.
specific problem.
I think that's where the process sort of became a process fatigue in the beginning because like I wasn't necessarily educated enough to educate others on why we need to do certain things in Scrum. I just knew that Scrum told me to do sprint planning and story pointing, right, without really understanding what that purpose was. Um, and I think the other difference between how we did Scrum and Kanban was that we got some very extensive training for Kanban, as you could tell from my story,
Mhm.
and that educated me enough to advocate for certain things. Hey, if we walk the board from right to left, we're going to be able to prioritize closing things sooner rather than starting things too quickly, which could cause a chaos in our board, which is what's happening on our board right now or at some point, right? So, and I sort of try to tailor that to immediate concerns or immediate questions that were sort of naturally rising from the other team members. So I think that's why maybe I worked that better.
Mhm. Very good. Would anyone else have another question for David or any comments?
Richard says great presentation. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, no
Yeah,
problem. I actually have a good question for you.
yeah, go for it.
Uh, you admitted that the reason why you switched it from Scrum to Kanban was no not because of any fault on the Scrum side, right? But
Yeah.
but it doesn't sound like Scrum wasn't given a fair chance at all. So
Right.
if you reconsider the whole situation now, do you have any good reasons why Kanban would still be a better choice, or do you think Scrum has an equal chance and you would be willing to give it a try again?
So it's a tough decision. It's a great question, but it's tough to answer from an ops engineer's team's perspective, because it really depends on what your team organization, team expectation is, relative to perhaps other dev teams. But if your ops group still is expected to tackle X amount of ad hoc items, I think there has to be some component of Kanban, and particularly just because of the expedite lane. And so I'll give you actually a real example. I know a colleague of mine that's actually trying to implement both for doing Scrum for uh, to accommodate, I guess, to fit into, I guess, the PI planning structure, and to implement, like a strict biweekly plannings and sprints to, sort of make it as a minor forcing function for his team to focus on project work. And I think I'm down for that, right? But at the same time, my understanding is the intention is to also keep some component of Kanban to accommodate for the auto request, because we know that that's going to come in, the defects and the incidents, and hey, ops, can you help me diagnose this? Can you help me work with this pipeline? Can you help me with this DNS server change, or any of that sort, right? So I think the answer probably is going to be different depending on who you ask that. But even among the ops engineers, But that would be my answer. If I were to do it all over again, if I have to consider Scrum, I would say why not? Like I said, there's nothing wrong with Scrum. It's a great tool for facilitating, having a bit more rigid structure and facilitating, project work in an agile fashion. I love it. Right now, though, personally, I'm in love with our current process too much that I don't really see a good reason for moving away from it, if you know what I mean. Yeah, so I gave you a couple of different angles. Hope that answers your question.
All right, thanks for the great answer.
All right. Then all that's left then is to thank David for the presentation, for sharing the story. And thank you all of you for taking some time today to join and participate here. And with this, we just close the 2024 year. So stay tuned for an announcement about the January session. I'm hoping to have that out after the holidays, and I will see you then. And hopefully more sessions of Kanban. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.